Tonight, we're very excited to welcome to Politics and Prose Susan Shirk for her newest book, Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. A devastatingly lucid portrait of China today, in which her extensive interviews and meticulous analysis reveal the dynamics driving overreach. To counter it, she argues the worst mistake the rest of the world, and the U.S. in particular, can make is to overreact. Understanding the domestic roots of China's actions will enable us to avoid the mistakes that could lead us to war. Susan is a research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. She is the author of China, Fragile, Superpower, and the Political Logic of Economic Reform in China. And from 1997 to 2000, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. Joining Susan in conversation tonight will be Edward Wong, a diplomatic correspondent at the New York Times who reports on foreign policy from D.C. He has worked for the Times for more than 23 years, reporting for 13 of those as an international correspondent and bureau chief from Iraq and China. He was a recent fellow at the Wilson Center and at the Belfer Center of Harvard Kennedy School. Edward is a recipient of the Livingston Prize for his reporting from Iraq, and he is a member of a Baghdad bureau team that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So now please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose Susan Shirk and Edward Wong.
Great. Thank you all for coming out here. Thanks, Susan, for being in conversation tonight.
Well, it's a great treat to do this with you, Edward. Thank you.
I first met Susan in 2008. Shortly after I was posted to Beijing, I arrived in Beijing in April of 2008, as a lot of correspondents did several months before the Olympics. And Susan then came to Beijing, and we met for lunch at a Sichuan restaurant in central Beijing. And I remember at the time I had just finished reading one of her books, Fragile, Superpower, in order to prepare for my tour in China. I thought it was the best book on Chinese foreign policy that had come out, and it served as an invaluable guide over the coming years as I reported on China and its interactions with the world. So when I started reading this book, what struck me was that it seemed to pick up right where Fragile Superpower had left off. It acts as a sequel to that book and covers the exact period that I was reporting from China from 2008 onward. So, Susan, I'd like to ask you, after you wrote about Chinese foreign policy in Fragile Superpower, what made you decide to turn to writing a more expansive book about both foreign policy as well as domestic politics in China during the period we're talking about?
Well, exactly at the moment you and I first met, 2000. What?
Mike's not on.
It's not on? It's on. Okay. How's that? Is it on? Okay, great. Just at the moment, during that period when you and I met, there were some surprising developments, not just in Chinese foreign policy, but in domestic policy as well. And let's start with domestic policy. There was this crackdown on the media and internet after the first term of Hu Jintao had been peak freedom of information. It was really an exciting time. As you'll recall, there was investigative journalism, there was debate on Weibo, the internet, social media, but there was tightening up before the Olympics, also on civil society, grid management of society, and at the same time, we saw change in the way China was acting in the South China Sea. And the state was taking a more heavy handed role in managing the economy. So all these things were happening, a number of them, such as social grid management and tightening up domestically. I thought, well, this is just before the Olympics. This always happens in China before big events, and afterwards things will loosen up. But they didn't loosen up ever after. So I was puzzled what was going on, because in Fragile Superpower, I talked a lot about the pressure of popular nationalism. But the public wasn't paying much attention at all to South China Sea, nor was the media. So I was puzzled, and I wanted to figure out what was going on. And that was really the motivation for me to start to work on this book.
Right, and you covered a lot of ground, digging into the party and the internal workings of the party. I wanted to start this part of the conversation first looking at the most immediate headlines that we're seeing, which is Xi Jinping, who has been the leader of China for the last decade and has just extended his term for at least another 5 years and maybe longer. This just happened at the 20th Party Congress, which ended a week or so ago. But can you tell us, from your perspective and based on your research in the book, what's the prism through which you see Xi and the actions that he took at this 20th Party Congress, and and what does that tell us about the direction China is going right now?
Well, as a China scholar, it's always really depressing to see history unfolding in front of your eyes, and to have the intellectual satisfaction of seeing that your analysis is correct and things are continuing to go that way, namely Xi Jinping's overreach. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, be so depressed because this is so bad for China. So the costs are piling up. The third term will be, I think, are likely to be worse than even the first decade. And so the 20th Party Congress, of course, what happened is that Xi Jinping made this play for a third term. There was no question that he was going to get his third term. The Central Committee just kind of rolled over and gave it to him. But what seems to have shocked even the most sophisticated observers inside China is that he went so far to surround himself only with loyalists. He got rid of all the age norms in order to clear out 4 people in the standing committee so he could appoint his cronies, his loyalists. And what this means is that there's no one at the top to question Xi Jinping's strategic myths, his policy preferences, and the pressure on subordinates is going to continue to be very intense, so that they feel that they have to prove their loyalty to this one man. Mm-hmm. And the way they do that is by carrying out his wishes, his preferences to an extreme. So that is really the dynamic in this personalistic leadership system that leads to overreach.
Right. I like the term you use, strategic myths. I think that's a fairly unique term. I think it's something that we'll hear more of here in Washington. Can you tell us some of the strategic myths that you think Xi has embraced and that he's either pushed during this period of overreach you cover, or that you see him formulating now and that he'll push in the coming years?
Well, I mean, one strategic myth is that the objective of the United States is to carry out a color revolution in China and topple the Communist Party. And that's a strategic myth he shares with Vladimir Putin, right? This is the basis for the affinity that these two leaders share. Um, and he also, another strategic myth is that China is hugely popular around the world, whereas in fact there really is a growing backlash against China's behavior, especially in advanced industrial countries, but even in developing countries. But Xi Jinping believes, I think he believes, I'm not sure, but he talks as if he believes that Chinese diplomacy is hugely successful.
Right. Can you tell us about some of the moves that he has made in the Asia region, namely on the South China Sea, which you started covering in Fragile Superpower, but the moves have become much bolder since then. The East China Sea, the Indian Himalayas. We can talk a little bit about Taiwan later because I think that's a big subject. But some of these ideas of territorial integrity and Chinese expansion as she has pushed. And can you tell us
Sure.
how you see that?
Sure. I mean, it was really a shame because the beginnings of the Biden administration did offer an opportunity for the possibility of some stabilization in U.S. China relations. But instead, Xi Jinping ramped up the pressure against Japan in the East China Sea with a lot more Coast Guard and military um, movements, especially near the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, and the same with Taiwan, and crossing the midline more frequently, even before Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. Picking, the fight on the Indian border, in which there were more casualties than there'd been in many, many years in that area of conflict. And in the South China Sea, Xi Jinping had taken plans for building out these artificial islands and fortifying them with military installations. These plans had been on the shelf. The military had prepared them quite some time before in the Hu Jintao era. But Xi took them and actually carried them out. And then, of course, he pledged to President Obama that he wouldn't militarize them, but went back on that pledge.
And why do you call this overreach? I mean, how is this distinct from the way Chinese leaders acted in the post-Mao era?
Well, after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came in. Uh, Chinese leaders exercised tremendous restraint in their foreign policy because, and they wrote about this, their objective was to reassure their neighbors, especially, and the United States, that even as China became more capable economically, militarily, its intentions were benign. So it wasn't a threat. And they did, remember that period where there were all these studies of rising powers and which ones messed it up and which ones managed to rise peacefully. And so they were following this peaceful rise strategy, which today some people are skeptical. Oh, they think this is all inevitable. But I don't agree with that. I think there's a lot of human agency here. And, but beginning under Hu, It was a matter of different interest groups, I think, were really driving the overreach.
Mhm.
But with Xi Jinping, he has consolidated control over all of these sectors, and he's really in charge. So he also bears responsibility. I call it overreach because what overreach means is to take things too far, to do things in an exaggerated way, in a manner that snaps back to harm yourself. And when you look at the reaction in the region, I think it's pretty clear that this is not working well for China. It's costly to China's own national security because China is surrounded by 20 neighbors. If they can manage through, it's the largest trading partner of all of those countries, basically. So if they can manage through economic interdependence and smart diplomacy to have good relations with these countries, that's a huge security blanket for China. But they've gone the opposite direction.
Right. And that's on Chinese foreign policy. What about some of its domestic policies? You started off talking about some of the security controls and controls on speech in assembly under the Hu Wen era, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, the prime minister. How did she take that and then move that into an era of overreach, the domestic policies on security plus economic planning, like state control of the economy? What direction did she take that once he became leader?
Yeah, he went. Is that on? He went in the same direction with those policies, but uh, the the process, the decision making process, was much more centralized, and the pressure on lower level officials was really intense because she started his rule with this massive anti corruption campaign, which was also effectively a purge against potential rivals. And now it continues right up to today. And the eve of the 20th Party Congress was, I would say, the third wave of the purge. And the people being purged were the senior officials in the internal security police and the party discipline bureaucracies who had been so trusted that they were the inquisitors, the investigators of the first round. And now they themselves have been convicted of not just corruption, but it's openly charging them with plotting against the party. So this is, and they have death penalties, which have been suspended, so it's lifetime in prison. They're never going to leave prison. And this is really what Zbigniew Brzezinski called a permanent purge under Xi Jinping. And officials are terrified, and they know that one wrong move, if they're viewed as disloyal, then they may be investigated. I mean, I tell a story in the book about going to the Taiwan office, Taiwan Affairs office, and the night before I'm to go have a meeting with the vice head of the Taiwan Affairs office, I get a call that this guy's been taken away by the discipline police. And there are several officials, including a vice head of propaganda who I had met and then got taken away. And, it's not clear that the people, I've never really seen a good analysis of the pattern of who has been targeted. But certainly many of the people I'm familiar with had been known as sort of more reform-minded figures.
And in the book, you write about how after the Mao era, Deng Xiaoping and other party elders put in place this idea of consensus rule, that at the top of the party, there would be multiple people who would have to weigh in on policy, and that there would be consensus among them before people move forward. But obviously, Xi has changed that. Why do you think that the party elders allowed that structure to change? Were they coerced into it? Or did she start to move the party along in a direction they were comfortable with, but then accelerated it?
I think the latter. If you look at the 2012 work report to the Party Congress, then when Xi Jinping comes into power, Hu Jintao gives the work report, and they call for stronger centralized leadership. So there was a recognition that collective leadership had problems. And the main one was this corruption that had gotten really insidious, and really a lot of the senior party people were worried that it would undercut popular support for party rule. So Xi Jinping had kind of a mandate to try to, and they went to a smaller standing committee from 9 to 7. But I don't think, he certainly had not acted like a strongman leader earlier. In fact, he had been elected in a straw poll. He had a father who was respected as a Deng Xiaoping colleague, Long March comrade, and a reformer who helped found the special economic zones. And his whole career was in the eastern provinces that are more cosmopolitan, more reform-minded. So, he acted like, somebody suggested to me, this is like an American judge who pretends to be something in order to get appointed to a position, and then turns out to be very different. And certainly, people did not expect a leader who would act more like Mao Zedong himself.
And what's your view on how the U.S. has reacted to all this? I mean, we've had multiple administrations interacting with Xi now. They've all taken different approaches to China. Can you tell us a little bit about the trajectory that you've witnessed of U.S.-China policy and where we're at today?
Well, as I mentioned before, there was this opening at the start of the Biden administration, which Xi Jinping blew by behaving aggressively in a way that even the people I know who were part of the Biden administration, who really wanted to resume active diplomacy and try to stabilize relations, what happened, I saw it before my eyes. The Biden team, they just hardened their policy, largely because of the way China was behaving. And so that, I've been really very disappointed, because we haven't had any real diplomacy for 6 years now. We haven't tried to resolve disputes and actually influence Chinese behavior for about 6 years. I'd say the accounting standard negotiation is a rare example of effective diplomacy. And instead, it's like folks in America have kind of given up on China. They've concluded that the game's over. China is our adversary, so the best thing we can do is just try to degrade their capabilities, trip them up. And so there doesn't seem, when I was in government, we used sanctions, but we used the threat of sanctions for China's proliferating behavior. And Bob Einhorn or others, we would say, to Beijing, if you don't clean up your act, we're going to level these sanctions. And China did clean up its act. So, you can use sanctions to induce changes in China's behavior, or you can try. Now, I'm actually agnostic about whether or not effective diplomacy will influence Xi Jinping to moderate his policies. I don't know the answer, but I do think that we should try. And until we make a serious effort, we shouldn't react. I feel that what we've been doing is overreacting. Even though I think I'm as critical of China's overreach as anybody, but I also think that U.S. policy could be more nuanced and more effective.
Part of, I guess, the sort of paradigm that a lot of administrations have viewed China with since the 1990s onward is that building economic ties with China would change the direction that their political system was going in. And you worked in government at a time, I think, when trade was one of the main platforms of the relationship, and trade grew. Can you tell us what you think of that paradigm now? Do you think, like some people ask, did strategic thinkers in the U.S. get that wrong? And I'm wondering what you think of that question.
No, I don't think we got it wrong, and I think it actually did have an impact on the modernization of Chinese society, and on the economy, marketizing the economy. And, up until 2007-8, the first term of Hu Jintao was really pretty remarkable, as I mentioned, about openness of media. I mean, at the time, I edited a book called Changing Media, Changing China. I had students doing projects on, the civil sphere on Weibo, and it was pretty remarkable. And we had NGOs starting to develop, environmental NGOs, all of those kinds of things. Now, a lot of people caricature U.S. engagement policy as naive. But, none of us have ever assumed that China was going to democratize overnight. But we did believe that it would make for a more responsive Communist Party-led government. And that's actually what happened until the second term, where I have a story, as you know, in the book that explains what went wrong then.
Right. Let's talk about that second term, about 2008 as a pivotal period. Can you tell us, 2008 was a momentous year in China for several reasons. You had the Olympics, the symbolic value of that. You had protests on the Tibetan Plateau. You had the financial collapse around the globe that started in American banks and that China reacted very strongly to. Can you tell us then what you see as the changes that took place that started China in a new direction at that point?
Well, I do think the global financial crisis had a big impact. But what the surprising story in my book is how these things started before the global financial crisis, and they were more internally generated by the way this collective leadership worked. Hu Jintao was a weak leader. He never, Jiang Zemin, the retired previous leader, was still meddling, especially in the military. The military really, you could argue, never came under Hu Jintao's control. I mean, some of my interviews were pretty remarkable about Hu trying to tell the military what to do and their insubordination, refusing to follow. And then what happened is you had a 9-person standing committee, so it's really a larger oligarchy. Each of the barons was responsible for his own domain. And instead of coming to a consensus through deliberation, each one of them just went his own way. So uh, uh, it's a kind of log rolling situation, although it's not the same as log rolling in the American Congress. But what you got is overreach, an exaggerated outcome, because all the other barons would go along with what each one wanted to do in his domain. And the most striking example of this is what I call the control coalition. And this is Zhou Yongkang in the second term. He was the internal security czar, very powerful politician. And nobody put any constraints on the way he created more of a police state inside China.
I'll turn to audience questions in a minute, but let me ask one more question, which is coming back to the U.S. You describe a scenario now in which we're trying to degrade China. We're no longer trying to partner with it in any serious way. Are we now in a security dilemma where each side is looking at moves that the other one is making and interpreting it in the worst possible light, and it ends up in a self-fulfilling prophecy of greater conflict?
Well, yes. I mean, I do think there's a security dilemma dimension to it. But it's kind of more complicated than that, I think, in the sense that I think now we're reluctant. Well, first of all, there are a lot of domestic pressures inside the United States now that are leading us to target China as the foil for our domestic politics. So, and I think President Biden, who had these big, ambitious legislative programs of self-strengthening for America that he wanted Congress to approve, and we have these very narrow Democratic margins. So what he did was say, this is how we're going to prove democracy works, and contrast what we can do with China as the adversary or at least competitor. And then in Congress, we have this bipartisan consensus, and also in public opinion. And you think about it, the public has now heard Donald Trump for 4 years, and many people in his administration inveigh against China. I mean, not Donald Trump himself, actually, until the eve of his re-election campaign, when he got really concerned about that. But the rest of his administration, he kind of gave the green light to the hawks in the different parts of the administration. And so the public has heard criticism of China, especially during COVID, for 4 years. Then a Democratic administration whose rhetoric isn't that different. And so it's no surprise the public's turned very sour on China. So all of these domestic factors, I think, are involved as well, and as well as security dilemma.
Great. I see someone's already standing at the microphone,
Okay.
So you get the first question.
Thank you for writing this book. It's been a fascinating discussion. I look forward to reading your book
Great.
as soon as possible. So my question is about overreach domestically, and to what extent, if it's possible to know, to what extent has there been pushback domestically in the area of social grid control. The social credit system seems to me mind-boggling that you get this color, if I understand it correctly, you earn credits based on behavior. That seems pretty all-inclusive to me. What do the business leaders think of this overreach? What do young people that are unemployed think about this? Is there any domestic pushback that you can talk about?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't been to China since the winter of 2020. So I don't know, but I do have some communication with people in China, however limited. And many, let's start with the business people. The private business people are, they are extremely worried. There was a very good article in the paper today about that. And many of them have already left China. And those who haven't are planning to. Because the 2021 crackdown on private business, was really quite broad and very arbitrary and very sudden. And it makes the private business people feel that they are at risk, not just of expropriation, but also at risk of being rounded up and targeted and thrown into jail. And a number of them have. So as to young people, that is really, I don't know for sure, because Xi Jinping has quite effectively mobilized a nationalist upsurge in China, arguing that the United States and the West is just trying to keep China down, and that we have this complete hostility toward China. And although I believe that that's a strategic myth that is useful for Xi Jinping to inculcate, that's another reason that I'm concerned about our overreactions.
Thank you.
Hi. Could you please speak to how China's economic growth prospects play into your thesis, specifically with how their population may have peaked and how it'll be more difficult, if not impossible, to achieve these large, robust growth targets that they hit in the period that you've been describing?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's certainly the case that there are a number of structural, secular reasons why Chinese growth was going to slow down no matter what, especially demography, the shrinking of the working age population. And with slower growth, now we have this question of how will Xi Jinping maintain popular support for Communist Party rule? If people's living standards are not improving dramatically and they're feeling a lot of pressure, right now we have youth unemployment for the first time in many years. We don't really know what that will mean in terms of foreign policy or domestic policy. I wish I could give you a better answer, but there is a risk of diversionary conflict, trying to distract people by picking fights with other countries.
Go ahead.
So I just building on that last discussion. It seems to me that there's a dynamic in our relations with China. Is this on? It's on? Okay. an economic dimension, and that is that our whole there are two things driving the U.S. not to want to depend on Chinese exports to the U.S. as much as it has. One, of course, is our worries about security, but the other one is just with a working class and anxieties about having their jobs displaced, and all that has now become a huge dynamic in the United States, and it just seems to me that that's going to have is it going to have a big effect on China, on its growth prospects, and therefore the security of the party.
Well, the interdependence between China and the United States has been good for both countries, but it has put a lot of strain on some communities in the United States. The whole China shock thesis and research, which was done by my then colleague Gordon Hansen and David Autor, shows that. So, I think that's certainly part of the reality, but decoupling our economies is also going to be extremely wrenching. And in my view, it's going to be very damaging to America's competitiveness. And so I think that I'm hoping that after the midterm, American politicians and analysts can think hard and long about the trade-offs in these different policies to make sure that we don't really damage ourselves in an effort to punish China.
So I guess this follows up on that to some degree. So can you say a little bit more about where you see U.S. opportunities to actually have an effective dialogue again, especially given that your thesis is really that most of the things that have propelled Xi are internal to China.
Right.
It's not in reaction. And
Right.
maybe as part of that, especially with the decoupling, say a little bit about how you think about the new export controls on chips.
Well, I think I'd like to see sanctions used as leverage, not as, just punishment, just to whack them. And, I think there are ways we could do that. Semiconductors are a category unto themselves. So our task force that I co-chair with Orville Schell, and we did a report on technology, and we advocate openness by and large. We think that America, the secret of American success is our open market economy. And if we emulate China by politicizing our economy, we're going to damage ourselves. But we carve out semiconductors. But what I think would be a mistake is to expand these restrictions on collaboration, technological collaboration, to a lot of other areas, including biomedical and everything else. I think that would really be, the whole world would lose out, because so much of the great research and business collaborations in these areas are done with Chinese and Americans. And it's going to retard progress severely. And then, of course, we're also driving all the talented Chinese out of the United States. I mean, that's an exaggeration, obviously, but it really, we've put a cloud of suspicion over all these people in a way that is really very damaging to our own innovation ecosystem.
North Korea really depends a lot on China for its trade. Why isn't it a useful argument to make to the Chinese? If you're such a great power, why can't you stop the North Koreans from tossing missiles around Asia?
That's a really good question. I mean, I've been to North Korea 5 times, and I decided it was so frustrating. I would simply concentrate more on China. But during certain periods, the Chinese actually have been quite cooperative in putting sanctions on North Korea. But when they're frustrated in their relationship with us, they don't feel that they, and they don't want to do it as a favor to the United States.
Yes, could you talk about what is the thinking with the extreme COVID policy that they have in China? I mean, is it, at first I thought, well, they're trying to save people, but now it seems to be much more political and about control than true concern about health. So I was just wondering if you feel like this is fitting into Xi's policies and exactly how that does that.
It's really very puzzling, isn't it? And I think that the rigidity of the Xi regime now is being shown by this inability to make the transition. I think they're going to make the transition, but I think Xi, and again, it's a demonstration of the insecurity of Xi Jinping and of all Chinese leaders, but especially Xi Jinping, because he's put so much pressure on everybody to say how the Chinese system is better than Western systems, and he's the greatest leader there's ever been. And so he just refuses to back down. He's got this slogan, what is it? Persistence is triumph, or something like that. I don't think it's about control, but they are certainly have gotten a lot of experience in learning how to control people's behavior. And they have all this amazing technology now that enables them to track everybody's behavior. I think that Xi is just so afraid of when the transition comes, people will die. Some people will die. Obviously, what they need to do is start by vaccinating everybody and require it. I don't understand why you can require that people go into these quarantine facilities, but you can't require them to be vaccinated. So first you should do that. Then I believe they have authorized Paxlovid. So and then you have to build more hospital facilities. And then you just have to, make the transition, even though certainly people will get sick and some people will die.
Professor Shirk, I wouldn't want you and Mr. Wong to leave without getting to Taiwan. So the question is, what is your assessment of the strategic risk, and how do you assess the handling of it officially here in America and in the public?
Well, the Biden administration has tried to make clear that its policy has not changed. But that's pretty difficult when the president has been saying different things. So it's really been a very messy situation, which has sown confusion, especially in China.
Just one note on that. When you talk to some U.S. officials, they half jokingly say, oh, the policy of ambiguity still exists since the confusion still exists. Like the U.S., it's an unspoken term, but there's a term strategic ambiguity, which is how the U.S. is supposed to approach the question of whether it will militarily defend Taiwan. You're supposed to leave it unsaid. But Biden has said 4 times that he would send the U.S. military to defend Taiwan. But as Susan just pointed out, it's sown confusion. And so U.S. officials say, well, doesn't that prove that we still have this unspoken policy of ambiguity? But go ahead.
But of course, the most serious question is how patient is Xi Jinping? How prudent is Xi Jinping? Previous Chinese leaders have been very prudent in regard to Taiwan. And the United States and Beijing, mostly tacitly, have managed the situation quite well, as has the most politicians in Taiwan as well. But the problem is, having just looked at all this overreach by Xi Jinping, all these imprudent decisions, I do worry more now about his poor judgment. But remember that there is another strategic myth inside China, which is that any Chinese leader who uses force against Taiwan and loses comes down. The people will rise up and bring him down, maybe bring down party rule. Is that true? Who knows?
Putin is still in power, and he's strategically lost his war in Ukraine already.
Okay, well, that may be the way in which the Russian example has a really negative impact on Xi Jinping's thinking, that you can get away with this kind of thing. But in any case, I'm not losing sleep over Xi Jinping's attention, because but what I do worry about is after the next election in Taiwan, a new president who may not be as judicious a leader as Tsai Ing-wen has been.
Any more questions? I see Jim Fallis there. Do you have a question, Jim?
Just like to see you both. I was just going to ask how the last, the experience in Ukraine, whether that's given any second thoughts to the PLA. That the war has not gone exactly the way the Russian military would have thought, and the PLA has been very sort of cocksure about how they would be. Has this given them any sort of, oh, wait a minute, thoughts?
Yeah, my colleague Tai Ming Chung, who's the expert on this, thinks that it has.
And do you think, does that matter? Would Xi Jinping listen?
Oh,
to
it
the
matters a whole lot, because even though Xi Jinping makes a lot of decisions on his own, he has a very narrow circle of people he consults. He is going to consult his senior generals, as Chinese leaders always have, and ask them, okay, if we go now, can you assure me we'll win? And if they say, in the past, they've said no. So let's hope they continue to say no.
Well, thank you, Susan. That was a great conversation.
Well, thanks so much.